Welcome. My name is John Peters. I'm a retired physician and also used to teach college biology before I went to medical school. And this is part 3 of 3 on the evidence for whale evolution, why it's voluminous. And I suggested it's overwhelming that whales have evolved when you look at all the evidence. So I'm hoping that this will be mostly new information for you. We're actually going to look at the DNA evidence and genetic evidence for whale evolution. Part 1 was looking at living whales and their cousins, their dolphins, cetaceans. And then part 2 was looking at whale fossils. And how that shows us that whales evolved from a terrestrial small animal, size of a raccoon, into the largest animal that's ever lived, the blue whale, as far as we know from the fossil evidence. So I'm going to transition over here to my slides, and I hope you enjoy part 3 of 3 of the evidence for whale evolution. And this part is on and concerns the DNA evidence. I'll also have some summary comments about this and in total. And then hopefully, if you had doubts about evolution, about big changes, macroevolution, that this will be an excellent example for you that we really do know that all the species have evolved on this planet through a process called evolution. Okay, so again, this is the opening slide, which shows a fossil Dorudon out of Egypt, and you can see how complete it is. And I'm sure that the paleontologists were wonderful and thankful that they found these fossils not in a jumbled state, but kind of laid out for them. Okay, so as just a brief review, hopefully you've had some high school or college biology, and you know that if we look at the nucleus of a cell that has a bunch of DNA in it, and DNA contains the instructions for making new cells, or if they specialize eventually into tissues and organs and an individual. But during a process where the cell is going to divide and split, the DNA, which is unraveled, condenses down into small packets that can be duplicated and then moved into 2 daughter cells. And so this represents metaphase at the chromosomal level, and chromosomes are just the DNA packets that are condensed down. This is an example of one that you might see. And if you begin to unravel it, it's coiled. And the coils are coiled secondarily around these protein molecules called histones. And if you unravel those, it's sort of like spaghetti and meatballs. You eventually get what's known as a double helix, or it looks like a ladder that's been twisted. And then if you untwist the ladder, you'll see that it has 2 sides, kind of the backbones of the DNA molecule. And then in the middle, the rungs of the ladder are essentially 4 different bases, and A bonds with T and C bonds with G. So if you know one side of the ladder, you know the other. And it's not important for us to know the biochemistry, but hopefully that's just review. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to try and drill down on the bases, go right down to the code, the ATCG sequence of nucleotides that spell out the messenger RNA, which then goes to the ribosomes to make proteins. Okay, so this is a little experiment in looking at 2 different species. One is a right whale, that's the one on top, and then the cow is on the bottom. This is specifically looking at a gene that makes milk. It's called the beta-casein, so all mammals have it. And evolution would predict that the animals that are most closely related would have the fewest differences between their beta-casein genes. And that's what we're going to do right now. We could do this with many other different proteins, such as and molecules such as cytochrome C, myoglobin, the hemoglobins, for example. But in this case, we've just chosen the beta-casein gene. And all we're going to do is compare the sequence of the DNA bases between the 2 species. There's no presuppositions, there's no assumptions here. It's just pure comparison of the genes. Okay, and we're going to start from left to right. And so that we speed things up here a little bit, I'm just going to kind of click through these, but I'll do a couple of them so you can see. So notice if you go from left to right, the right whale has AAT and the cow has ACG. The reason why these are grouped in threes is because that's how the some of the RNA reads the code in groups of three. So this would be the transfer RNA would be reading off of the messenger RNA, for those of you who remember your biology. So if we keep going, there's one difference. Can you see the AAT is not matched? It's AGT in the cow. And so we go down the rung and we find another one. A couple of them are the same. CCC and CAA are the same between the two. And then when we get to the ACG sequence in right whales, it has AGT in the cow, so it's different. All we're doing is just counting difference. We're not interpreting anything. We're just looking at the differences. So I'm going to kind of speed things up here a little bit. And if you went down the line and just all you're doing is noticing the differences, I think we come up with 9. Is that right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. So we're going to take that data point that there are 9 differences in the active gene section of this beta-casein gene. And we're also going to do it with a bunch of other species, and we're just going to put it into a table and take a look at it. And if you do that, this is the table you get. So notice on the left side, there's a sperm whale, porpoise, giraffe, hippo, cow, camel, deer, pig, peccary, rhinoceros. And on the bottom axis, we have the same. So if you look at the difference between a sperm whale and a right whale, they're almost identical. They only have 3 bases that are different on the DNA. If you look at a porpoise and a sperm whale, there's 2. If you look at a porpoise and a rhinoceros, there's 12 differences. They're very, very different groups of animals. According to evolution, they share a common ancestor, but you have to go so far back to find it that there's been a lot of mutations and changes since then. Here, the difference between a camel and a giraffe are 15, 12. So in general, you look at this and you go, that makes sense. The whales are mostly related to one another. And then the other animals that are farther away from each other tend to have more changes. But there's one animal on this chart that doesn't really make sense when you look at different kinds of animals. And if you look at hippos, just the genetic differences, it turns out that there's only 3 base changes between a hippo and a sperm whale, between a hippo and a porpoise. But hippos are land animals. I mean, they come out at night to basically to feed on different plants and then spend a lot of time in the water. But what this graph is telling you is that in this beta-casein gene, hippos are actually as closely related to a sperm whale as 2 whales are related to one another. That's very unusual. I think most people would not have predicted that. Okay, so when you look at the genetics of different land animals and whales, it turns out that hippos, a land animal, hippo, is more closely related to whales than it is to the other animals, according to that DNA sequence. So let's look at a different type of DNA. These are called transposons, and they're also called jumping genes because they can copy themselves and kind of do a copy and paste. So they're mobile. They make a copy of themselves. They jump out of the DNA and then they insert somewhere else in the chromosomes or in the DNA. And so some of these are called retrotransposons. They have to go from DNA to RNA and back to DNA. And they usually do this by using a type of transposon, which is called a line for long interspersed nuclear elements. But again, you don't need to know that. All you need to know is that there is some DNA that surprisingly scientists found jump around inside your chromosomes. And so as you can imagine, sometimes when they jump and land, they may knock out a very important gene and cause a horrendous mutation. And they actually do that quite a bit and cause cancer and disease. And your body has ways of suppressing this jumping because it can cause a lot of problems. It also can land into a gene and split it and cause brand new genetic information that we didn't have before. But this is the most important thing you need to take away. And that is when they jump randomly. They just land all over the place. So if you find between two different species that they have the exact same transposon in the same location, then you either have to mathematically figure out that the probability that random jumping just happened to land in the same spot in two different species, that could occur, but there are thousands of these transposons. And so many of them are in the same location. The only rational conclusion you can draw therefore is that if you have the same transposons in the same locations where they've jumped, those two species had to have had a shared ancestor at some time and inherited those transposons in that area. Mathematically, there really is no other conclusion that you can draw. So what we're going to take a look at, some species here, and I've blocked them out so you can't see. This is some data from Masato and his colleagues, and what they did was they did a bunch of transposon analysis for whales. They just went in and they just looked at the transposons they've got, the locations of them, make sure they were the same. And I think there were 16 of them that they looked at. Now, I'm kind of hiding what the whale species are from you right now, because I just want you to focus on the fact that whatever whale species this is on top, and the second one down from the bottom, can we all agree that if you find the same transposon in the same location because they're jumping around randomly, that these two species are very closely related, looking at these 16 transposons that they studied. Likewise, this one down here is related also to these two, but not as much. The transposons that they've labeled F through P, they don't share, they don't have them. And then you go down to this one and it's only got two that are shared among all the three up here. So we would predict, I think, that from what I've told you, just looking at transpond data alone, not the fossil record or not other DNA types, that the two on top would be most closely related, and then you would have less relations with the other ones on the bottom. And so let's reveal what we've got here. And it turns out that this data is from a bottlenose dolphin and a narwhal, and they are very closely related. They branched off very recently, and you can see that this is shown in this phylogenetic tree, this evolutionary tree that they've been able to construct using evolutionary principles, that the bottlenose and the narwhal are very closely related. The sperm whale down here is related to these two, but not as much. And then the humpback whale is branched off way back before the sperm whale and these four. So we can use transposon data, knowing how they work and what they are, and identify them to build an evolutionary tree, an evolutionary relationship. Okay, let's move on to this one. This is kind of an interesting little table here. They did the same thing, but they compared them to whales and something else. Now, again, even if you don't know the species, and I'm hiding them from you, here's the same transposons or different ones. I'm not sure whether these represent 16 new ones or the same ones, but can you see that whatever these two species are, they have almost identical transposon alignment, that they had to have shared the same ancestor because these things jump around randomly and they're found in the same place, in the same transposons. So, and then you look down here at these two, and you've got, again, the same pattern. They share different transposons than the top two, but they're the same. So I think knowing how this phylogenetic tree works that we're building, I think you would be very accurate, very true to say that whatever these two species are on top, they're very closely related. And then whatever these two are on the bottom, they're closely related, but it looks like they're different. They're in different groups than the two on the top. And then you have this one in the middle, and it doesn't seem to know what it wants to do. It's got some transposons that match all of them, and then some transposons that are only with this group, but not with that group. So let's see maybe what this is. And there's our transposon data. And you can see that deers and cows shared a common ancestor. fairly recently, and humpback whales and beaked whales also. And then here's our good friend, the hippopotamus. And what this is telling you is that based on transposon data, the hippopotamus is more closely related to whales than it is to deer and cows. And that's the same data that showed us in terms of the beta-casein gene, said the same thing using different DNA analysis. Okay, so a third line of evidence from the DNA is to look at pseudogenes. And pseudogenes are genes that have been knocked out by mutations that are no longer used in their original form or at all. And so it turns out when you look at the genomes of whales, they have a bunch of pseudogenes that are used for smelling on land that have been knocked out. We also have many, many pseudogenes for smelling that are no longer functional. And our ancestors certainly could smell very good and much better. Obviously, your dog and cat can smell much better than we can, and that's because they have olfactory genes that are still working and ours are not. But this group of researchers looked at the genes that have been knocked out to form teeth. And there are genes for forming the dentine, and there are genes that are forming enamel. And so it turns out that baleen whales, whales that have no teeth, they just have baleen for shifting out the zooplankton and different phytoplankton, that it turns out that they carry genes for making enamel. They have 3 dead genes, and 2 of them are frame shifts, and one of them contains stop codons. And a frame shift is where one of the nucleotides drops out. It shifts the entire code left to right, and it just messes up everything. So they're very bad mutations. And a stop codon is the 3 that when the messenger RNA is reading along, or the transfer RNA, it stops. Okay, and then one of the genes for making enamel has a big deletion out of it. A huge section of it is just gone, which killed the gene. And so we know that mammals, the placental mammals, carry these genes, or they carry them and they're dead genes, which harkens back to common ancestry with at the time that they could make teeth, but they don't make anymore. And so, and then I'm going to talk about a special one. This study only looked at one of the genes, enamelin, but there's also other ones that we're going to talk about in a few slides. So enamelin is another gene for making enamel that baleen whale species have, but it's a pseudogene. It's not working anymore. And so certainly I would posit that animals that have genes that were functioning before but not anymore, the best explanation of that is evolution. We talked about atavisms, where humpback whales, for example, 1 in 500 whales can actually make hind limbs that no whales have now, unless something goes wrong and it exposes the DNA that they have for making legs. Okay, so you can stop this and read it. And unfortunately, the next slide is extremely busy. However, if you want to read the legend here that tells you what all this is, you can certainly pause the slide. But I just want to show you that these little icons up here, there's teeth, and then there's some of the teeth have a cap on it. And so the base of the tooth represents dentine, the top of the tooth represents enamel, and then the X's that are through the teeth indicates that those animals don't have teeth anymore, but they carry the gene for making enamel. It's just knocked out. And so you can see here there's some pangolins that don't have teeth, but they carry the gene for making enamel. And then sloths, and then here's our good friends up here, all these whale species up here that that have the gene, but due to frame shift mutations, they cannot make the teeth anymore. And there are baleen whales. Okay, so it turns out that the study of this and these pseudogenes to make teeth and enamel and dentine was a little bit more complicated, because rather than just enamel, there were other genes that mammals have for making different teeth formation. And you can see that up here. We've got ameloblastin and amelogenin. But when they looked at the baleen species, those deactivated pseudogenes weren't shared by the baleen species. So they couldn't figure out what's going on, what's stopping the baleen from making teeth if they don't have any of those other genes. So what they thought was, okay, there must be a fourth pseudogene that the baleen whales have that we don't know about. And so they went looking for it. And sure enough, they found it. It was this enamelysine gene. And it turns out that they know how it got knocked out, that one of these jumping genes that we were talking about before landed right in the middle of the active gene and knocked it out. And so this is a sign. Remember I talked about a line for a long intersperse? Well, this is another group of pseudogenes, another group of transposons that are jumping around. They're shorter, so they're called short interspersed nuclear elements. Anyway, and so what happened was the ancestor of all the baleen whales, they had this gene for making teeth knocked out by one of these transposons that was jumping around. Okay, so I want to diverge a little bit and show you a picture of an animal. It's got some hair, looks like it's some hair bristles on it, and it's got some toenails here, and the foot looks like it's pretty flat. And so I wonder if anybody out there, if you're watching this, do you know what this is a picture of? You get a lot of kudos if you do. It turns out that this is the pad of the front pads of the manatees, and there's 3 species of them. And so the reason I'm showing you this is because people have also been looking at the DNA of manatees and comparing them with other species. And so here's a couple of studies I've listed here from 2007, Kellogg et al., and also by a Japanese researcher group. And the first one is that they tagged the chromosomes of manatees and began comparing them with other species. And they proved that manatees, their ancestry goes back to Africa. That's what it showed in 2007. And then there was also another group that was looking for analysis of this African origin, and they were using retroposons. So they were kind of doing the same thing that Meredith did, and the other researchers, when they were looking at hippos and whales using they were using genes for beta casein at that time, but the retroposon data also was useful for looking at manatees. So you go back here. So it turns out that when you do the genetic analysis, just like whales and hippos at some time shared a common ancestor, it also is true with manatees. They are derived from a common ancestor with elephants. So manatees are another group that used to be terrestrial, and then they've left the land and moved back into the ocean. Okay, so this is a summary slide of most of the things we've talked about. Part 1, we talked about living whales, and you can go through this and just the observations, the facts just go on and on and on about how you can look at living whales alone. Even if you didn't look at fossils or DNA, you could look at living whales and know that they are derived from a terrestrial ancestor. And then we also looked at the fossil whales, and remember just the involucrum. The incus also changes its orientation. It starts out on one angle and goes to another through evolution, through the fossil record. And then we looked at all those wonderful fossil intermediates, transition forms between toothed whales and baleen whales. And lastly, this part 3, we've been looking at DNA, protein sequences showing that whales are most closely related to hippos. And then we also looked at these sirenians here at the end and looking at the fact that they are most closely related to elephants. And so these are things that probably a non-evolutionary approach to life you would not have guessed in terms of kinds that whales and hippos were actually share an ancestor and were closely related, and certainly that manatees and elephants were basically from the same stock. But evolution can tell you that. You can make testable predictions and see if those things come out. So in conclusion, given all of this evidence, the only parsimonious explanation that fits all the facts, observations, that fits confirmed predictions is that whales have evolved from a terrestrial animal. And this animal goes back to at least Indo-Hyas and something that was similar to that, based alone on the involucrum and the other anatomy, which we didn't even discuss the fact that whales have specific teeth and skull structure, et cetera, that are more unique to them. So you can even tell from that. It's basically at this point, it's perverse, I believe, to continue to deny that whales have evolved. Now, there are a lot of things being published out there, videotape, YouTubes, and articles trying to discount whale evolution. But the vast majority of them, what they will do, from what I've seen, is they will give you an incredible list of adaptations, counter-current mechanisms, all the amazing things, echolocation that whales do. And then they will ask you that since they can't imagine how that all could have occurred in 10 million years, that they're not going to accept it. And I would invite you that the how these adaptations occurred is different from the what. Let me give you an analogy very quickly here as we wrap up. If you had a vacation cabin that you visited once every couple months, and you came upon it one day, drove up, and instead of your cabin being there, it was completely destroyed. The only thing that was left was the chimney. It was just obliterated. Now, you can argue how that happened. Was it an earthquake, fire, hurricane? Was it an explosion, maybe from one of your gas mains? Was it a mad neighbor who just got angry with you and bulldozed it down? Those mechanisms of how it was destroyed are secondary to the fact that it has been destroyed. The insurance company is not going to probably hold off very long settling your claim just because there's a little doubt about how it got destroyed. As long as it wasn't you that did it, they would have to investigate it. But even if there was some doubt about how it got destroyed, if they cleared you, then they would pay up, even if it wasn't completely settled. And that's what I'm trying to show you, is that it is beyond controversy now that whales have evolved. If you want to argue how it happened, that's great. That they do that all the time at biology and evolutionary conferences. Where horizontal gene transfer, endosymbiosis, Darwin's natural selection, group selection. What was it? But nobody in the major universities around the world doubt that evolution has occurred, and you shouldn't either. There's plenty of evidence through biogeography and genetics and genomics, anatomy, homology. I mean, it just goes on and on. Different fields have all come together. It's a very fruitful area. Even modern medicine is based upon evolution, and I'm not just talking about antibiotic resistance. So thank you for watching. I hope that if you've watched all 3 parts, and you literally go back over this summary slide here, that really it's beyond controversy anymore that that whales have evolved. And if we can understand that whales have evolved from an animal the size of a raccoon to a blue whale, then all the other things that are asserted about evolution are very much true also. All right, thank you for watching, hopefully all 3 parts. And now you know how scientists are certain that whales evolved. I will put a couple of important links, I think, at the bottom of part 3 here that you may want to look into, especially those people who are objecting to whales evolving. And remember, as you go through their videos and their articles, ask yourself, are they objecting to all the evidence for whale evolution? Or are they just not accepting it because it doesn't meet their particular standard of how could all this have happened in 10 million years? Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.